Between 1941 and 1945, in the vast territories of Eastern Europe, they developed one of the most systematic and brutal campaigns of extermination that humanity has ever witnessed. But what many do not know is that behind the battles that appeared in the newsreels of the time, there existed a parallel war, a hidden war, a war of shadows where orders arrived in sealed envelopes with the insignia of the imperial eagle, and where the executors acted under the cloak of night, without witnesses, without official records, without any trace that could directly link the Führer to the most atrocious crimes. How was it possible that millions of people disappeared without the world knowing? What secret mechanisms allowed these mass executions to be carried out under a veil of absolute silence? And why, after so many decades, do we continue discovering new documents that reveal the true magnitude of what occurred? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give a good like to the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments from where you are listening to us and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. What you are about to hear is not just a historical recount. It is a journey into the darkest depths of the Nazi regime, into the frozen forests of Belarus, into the mass graves of Ukraine, into the prisoner of war camps, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were systematically executed. It is the story of the orders that never should have existed, of the documents that were burned to erase all evidence, and of the testimonies that survived against all odds. The Eastern Front represented much more than a theatre of military operations. It was the stage where Adolf Hitler implemented his most radical vision, the systematic elimination of entire populations considered undesirable, according to the twisted National Socialist ideology. But unlike what happened in the concentration camps of the West, where there existed at least a facade of bureaucratic legality, in the East the executions were carried out in a direct, brutal, and above all, secret manner. Did you know that there existed special units whose sole mission was to follow the German army and execute civilians en masse? That verbal orders were issued that were never put in writing precisely to avoid leaving evidence? That some of the most bloodthirsty perpetrators received decorations and promotions for their efficiency in these macabre tasks? The history that we are going to unravel today begins long before the first German soldier crossed the Soviet border. It begins in the meeting rooms of Berlin, where the most sinister plans were gestated, where the extermination protocols were designed, and where the executors who would carry out the will of the dictator were selected. In the summer of 1941, while the world watched astonished at the apparently unstoppable advance of the Wehrmacht towards Moscow, something much more sinister was occurring in the rearguards. Special groups known as Einsatzgruppen advanced behind the front lines, but their mission was not to fight. Their mission was to murder. And they did it with a chilling efficiency that left in its wake a trail of mass graves and ghost towns. But who were these executors? How were they selected? And what led them to commit atrocities that defy all human comprehension? To understand the magnitude of what occurred on the Eastern Front, we must first understand the mentality that made it possible. Adolf Hitler did not see the war against the Soviet Union as a conventional conflict between nations. He saw it as a war of annihilation, a racial war, a war where the rules of conventional warfare did not apply. In his distorted vision of the world, the Slavic peoples were subhumans who had to be enslaved or eliminated to give living space to the German people, and the Jews, the communists, the intellectuals, and any other group that represented an ideological threat had to be exterminated without mercy. This vision was not a secret. Hitler had expressed it clearly in his book Mein Kampf, written during his imprisonment in 1924. But what was indeed a secret was the manner in which he planned to implement it, because it was one thing to talk about living space and racial purity in abstract terms, and a very different thing to order the systematic murder of millions of people. On the 30th of March of 1941, weeks before the start of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler gathered more than 200 senior officers of the Wehrmacht at the Reich Chancellery What he told them in that meeting would forever change the nature of the war they were about to fight. He explained to them that the campaign against the Soviet Union would not be an ordinary war. It would be a war of ideologies, a fight to the death between National Socialism and Jewish Bolshevism. And in this war, the conventions of The Hague and Geneva would not apply. Can you imagine the silence in that room? Can you imagine the glances that were exchanged between officers who had been trained in Prussian military traditions, who believed in concepts like the soldier's code of conduct and the dignified treatment of prisoners? Some of them must have felt a shiver running down their spines. Others, perhaps, felt a dark emotion at the prospect of what they were being authorized to do. But no one protested. No one stood up to question the orders. And that silence, that tacit consent, was the first step toward the abyss. 2 months later, on the 6th of June of 1941, one of the most infamous orders of the Second World War was issued, the Kommissar Order, known in German as Kommissarbefehl. This order, signed by General Wilhelm Keitel, but emanating directly from Hitler, established that all political commissars of the Red Army captured were to be executed immediately, without trial, without process, without record. They simply had to disappear. Why the commissars? Because in Hitler's mind, the political commissars represented the incarnation of Jewish Bolshevism. They were the ideological guardians of communism, the ones who maintained the morale of the Soviet troops, the ones who made sure that the soldiers fought to the last breath. Eliminating them was not just a military measure, it was an act of ideological purification. But the Commissar Order was only the beginning. What came next was much, much worse. On the 22nd of June of 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest surprise attack in military history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. But while the Panzer tanks advanced eastward at unprecedented speeds, and the Stukas bombed cities and columns of refugees, other units were beginning their own campaign, a campaign that would not appear in war communiques or propaganda films. The Einsatzgruppen, literally intervention groups, were special SS units composed of personnel from the Gestapo, the SD, the security service of the Nazi Party, the criminal police, and the Waffen-SS. They had been originally created during the annexation of Austria and the occupation of Czechoslovakia to secure the conquered territories, but for the Eastern Campaign their mission had been radically redefined. There were 4 main Einsatzgruppen, each assigned to a different sector of the front. Einsatzgruppe A operated in the Baltic countries and northern Russia. Einsatzgruppe B covered Belarus and central Russia. Einsatzgruppe C acted in Ukraine, and Einsatzgruppe D operated in southern Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus. Together, they numbered approximately 3,000 personnel, a figure that seems insignificant compared to the millions of soldiers of the Wehrmacht. But what these 3,000 achieved in terms of human destruction defies all proportion. How was it possible? How could so few cause so much damage? The answer lies in the way they operated. The Einsatzgruppen did not act alone. They had the support of auxiliary police units recruited locally, battalions of the German Order Police, and in many cases, the Wehrmacht itself. In addition, they took advantage of the latent anti-Semitism in many of the local populations, inciting pogroms that allowed them to externalize the violence while keeping their own hands relatively clean. But the most important thing was the method. The Einsatzgruppen did not improvise. Each operation was carefully planned. They would arrive at a town or city, gather the Jewish population under some pretext, a resettlement, a registration, a disinfection, led them to an isolated place, a forest, a ravine, an abandoned quarry, and then execute them with shots to the back of the neck. The bodies fell into graves that the victims themselves had been forced to dig. Then the grave was covered, and the Einsatzgruppe moved to the next target. It was a system of industrial murder implemented without gas chambers. without crematorium ovens, without the complex infrastructure of the extermination camps. Just bullets, mass graves, and silence. But who ordered these massacres? Where did the instructions come from? And how did they ensure that they could never be traced back to Hitler himself? This is where the story becomes truly chilling, because unlike other orders of the Nazi regime, the instructions for the Einsatzgruppen were rarely put in writing. They were transmitted verbally, in private meetings, in conversations that left no record. It was what historians have called the implicit chain of command. Everyone knew what was expected of them, but no one received direct written orders. This strategy was not accidental. Hitler was obsessively careful with his public image. He knew that history would judge him, and he wanted to make sure that he could never be directly linked to the most atrocious crimes. That is why he developed a communication system where his desires were transmitted through intermediaries, where orders were given in vague terms that could be interpreted in multiple ways, and where responsibility was diluted in a deliberately confusing chain of command. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, was the main intermediary in this system. It was he who translated Hitler's wishes into concrete orders for the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, and it was he who personally visited the zones of operations to ensure that the special tasks were being carried out as expected. There is a particularly revealing testimony of one of these visits. In August of 1941, Himmler travelled to Minsk to witness a mass execution. He wanted to see with his own eyes how his orders were being implemented. What he saw disturbed him deeply. According to witnesses, Himmler almost fainted when the first shots rang out and the bodies began to fall into the grave. His face turned green and he had to look away. But he did not order the execution to stop. Instead, he delivered a speech to the executors, thanking them for their sacrifice and assuring them that they were fulfilling a historical mission. He told them that he and the Führer assumed all responsibility for what they were doing, that their consciences could be clear because they were acting in the name of a higher cause. Can you imagine the perversity of that moment? The architect of death, unable to bear the sight of his own work, consoled in the executioners and absolving them of all guilt. But there was a practical problem that Himmler had not anticipated. The executors, many of them young soldiers, who had never fired at another human being, were suffering serious psychological consequences. Some became alcoholics. Others suffered nervous breakdowns. Some even committed suicide. The method of mass shooting, although effective, was destroying the perpetrators themselves. It was for this reason that Himmler ordered the search for more humane methods of execution. Not more humane for the victims, of course, but for the executioners. Thus were born the mobile gas vans, modified vehicles that channeled the exhaust gases into the rear compartment where the victims were crowded together. It was a cleaner, more distant method, which allowed the executors to kill without having to look into the eyes of their victims. But even the gas vans had their limitations. They could not process the massive quantities of victims that the regime had in mind. It was then that the development of extermination camps with fixed gas chambers began, an innovation that would allow the industrialization of genocide on an unprecedented scale. However, on the Eastern Front, mass shootings continued to be the primary method of execution throughout the war, and the numbers are simply overwhelming. In just the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators murdered approximately 500,000 Jews. By the end of 1942, that figure had surpassed 1 million. And if we add the non-Jewish victims, Soviet prisoners of war, Romani people, the mentally ill, actual or suspected partisans, and any other group considered undesirable, the total exceeds 2 million people executed by these units alone. But these are just statistics. Behind every number was a human being with a name, with a family, with dreams and hopes. How can we begin to comprehend the magnitude of this suffering? Perhaps the best way is to examine specific cases, particular massacres, that illustrate both the brutality of the system and the humanity of the victims. One of the most infamously celebrated episodes of the secret executions on the Eastern Front is the massacre of Babi Yar. It occurred on the outskirts of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, at the end of September of 1941, barely weeks after German troops captured the city. The context was the following. On the 19th of September, the Wehrmacht had occupied Kyiv after a fierce battle, but the Soviet resistance had not ended. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, had left behind sabotage teams that began to detonate explosives hidden in key buildings of the city. On the 24th of September, a series of explosions devastated the centre of Kyiv, including the building where the German headquarters had been installed. Hundreds of German soldiers and officers died. The Nazi reaction was immediate and brutal. Although the explosions had been the work of Soviet saboteurs, the Germans blamed the Jews of Kyiv. It was an absurd accusation from any logical point of view, but logic had no place in the Nazi mentality. Jews were the universal enemy, the perfect scapegoat for any misfortune. On the 28th of September, posters appeared all over Kyiv ordering all Jews to present themselves the following day at the intersection of Melnikova and Doktorov streets, near the Jewish cemetery. They were to bring their documents, valuables, and warm clothing. The poster suggested they would be resettled. Those who did not present themselves would be shot. Most of the Jews of Kyiv did not suspect what awaited them. Many genuinely believed they would be evacuated to some safe place. Some even expressed relief at the prospect of escaping a city devastated by war. At 6 a.m. on the 29th of September, they began to gather at the meeting point. By 8 a.m, there was a crowd of thousands of people. The elderly, women, children, entire families carrying suitcases and packages. What followed was one of the most efficient and ruthless mass murder operations in history. The Jews were led in columns towards the Babi Yar ravine, a natural depression located on the outskirts of the city. The path was flanked by German soldiers and collaborationist Ukrainian police, who beat those who tried to escape or moved too slowly. As they approached the ravine, the prisoners began to hear gunshots and to understand what awaited them. Some tried to flee, but were shot down instantly. Upon reaching the edge of the ravine, the victims were forced to hand over their belongings and completely undress. They were then led in groups of 10 toward the bottom of the depression, where the firing squads awaited them. The shooters fired with rifles and pistols, aiming at the back of the neck. The bodies fell in layers upon the corpses of those who had been executed minutes before. When a layer of bodies reached a certain height, the executioners covered them with a thin layer of earth and continued with the next group. The operation continued without interruption for 2 entire days. The executioners worked in shifts, relieving each other when physical and mental exhaustion became unbearable. Vodka was distributed to strengthen the nerves of the executors. Officers supervised the operation with stopwatches, measuring the efficiency of the process. When everything ended, on the 30th of September of 1941, more than 33,000 Jews had been murdered at Babi Yar, 33,771 to be exact, according to the official report of Einsatzgruppe C. It was the highest number of victims in a single operation of this type up to that moment. But Babi Yar did not end that day. During the following months and years, the ravine continued to be used as an execution site. Soviet prisoners of war, Romani people, psychiatric patients, Ukrainian nationalists, who had ceased to be useful to the Nazis, and many others were brought there to be murdered. It is estimated that the total number of victims at Babi Yar exceeds 100,000 people. And who ordered this massacre? Where did the instruction to murder the entire Jewish population of Kyiv come from? Historical documents show that the decision was made in a meeting held on the 27th of September between the military commander of Kyiv, Major General Kurt Eberhard, the police chief of the city, the commander of Einsatzgruppe C, Otto Rasch, and the commander of Sonderkommando 4A, Paul Blobel. They agreed that the Jews of Kyiv had to be executed as a reprisal for the explosions. But who gave them the authority to make such a decision? The answer takes us back to the implicit chain of command. Himmler had visited Kiev just days before and had met with the SS officers in the area. Although there is no written document recording his instructions, subsequent testimonies suggest that he verbally authorized drastic actions against the Jewish population, and Himmler, in turn, acted on behalf of Hitler. It is the pattern we see over and over again in the secret executions of the Eastern Front. Verbal orders, meetings without minutes, deliberately obscured chains of responsibility, all designed so that if one day the perpetrators were called to account, they could claim they were only following orders, without being able to point exactly to where those orders came from. But the history of Babi Yar has an additional chapter that reveals even more about the Nazi mentality. In the summer of 1943, as the German army began to retreat before the Soviet advance, Nazi authorities decided it was necessary to erase the evidence of their crimes. A special unit was created, known as Sonderkommando 1005, whose mission was to exhume the bodies from the mass graves and burn them. At Babi Yar, this macabre task was assigned to a group of prisoners, many of them Jewish, who were forced to unearth the corpses and pile them into massive funeral pyres. They worked in chains, under the constant surveillance of SS guards, who had orders to execute them when the work was finished. The prisoners knew this. They knew that when the last pyre extinguished, they would be the next to die. It was in these desperate circumstances that a group of prisoners planned a daring escape. On the night of the 29th of September of 1943, exactly 2 years after the original massacre, a handful of men managed to break their chains, disarm the guards, and escape through tunnels they had secretly dug. Of the 300 prisoners who made up the Sonderkommando at Babi Yar, only 15 managed to survive and escape. It was they who, after the war, gave testimony of what they had witnessed. Can you imagine the courage it took to attempt that escape? The determination to live, to survive, to bear witness, in the midst of the most desperate circumstances a human being can face. But Babi Yar was just one of the countless massacres that occurred on the Eastern Front. To understand the true magnitude of the secret executions, we must look beyond the most well-known cases and examine the systematic pattern of violence that spread throughout the entire region. In Lithuania, Einsatzgruppe A, under the command of Franz Walter Stahlecker, implemented a particularly sinister strategy. Instead of carrying out the executions directly, Stahlecker preferred to incite the local population to perpetrate pogroms against the Jews. This had several advantages from the Nazi perspective. It allowed them to maintain the facade that the crimes were spontaneous and not ordered by the Germans. It reduced the psychological burden on the SS executors themselves, and it complicated any future investigation by involving local collaborators. In Kaunas, the second largest city in Lithuania, the Nazis found enthusiastic collaborators in the so-called Lithuanian activists, nationalist groups that had suffered under the Soviet occupation and who channeled their resentment toward the Jews. Between the 23rd and 27th of June of 1941, these collaborators perpetrated a series of pogroms that left more than 3,500 Jews dead. One of the most brutal episodes of these pogroms took place in a garage in the Litukis neighborhood. There, before a crowd of spectators that included German soldiers with cameras, a group of Lithuanians armed with iron bars beat dozens of Jews to death. The photographs of this massacre, which show piled bodies, while the crowd watches impassively, became some of the most disturbing images of the Holocaust. Stahlecker was delighted. In his report to Berlin, he wrote with evident satisfaction that he had succeeded in setting in motion pogroms of considerable scale, and that the Lithuanian collaborators had proven to be extremely effective. But he also noted that, despite the violence of the pogroms, these were not enough to fulfill the objectives of the regime. More systematic operations were needed. And so the large-scale executions began. The Kaunas fortress, known as the Ninth Fort, became the main execution site. Between July and December of 1941, more than 30,000 people were murdered there, the majority of them Jewish. The procedure was similar to that of Babi Yar. Victims were transported in trucks, forced to undress, and shot at the edge of mass graves. But the Ninth Fort had an additional characteristic that made it particularly valuable for the Nazis. Its underground fortifications provided a discreet place to hold prisoners before their execution, away from the sight of the civilian population. This allowed the secrecy of the operations to be maintained, at least partially. In Latvia, the pattern was similar. Einsatzgruppe A worked in close collaboration with the Latvian Auxiliary Police, known as the Arais Commando, to exterminate the country's Jewish population. Victor Arais, the founder and commander of this unit, was a former police officer who had become a fanatical anti-Semite. Under his leadership, the Arais Commando participated in the execution of more than 26,000 Jews in the Rumbula forest alone, near Riga. The Rumbula massacres took place on the 30th of November and the 8th of December of 1941. They were planned with military precision. The Jews of the Riga ghetto were taken from their homes in the early hours of the morning and forced to march towards the forest. Those who could not walk, the elderly, the sick, young children, were murdered on the spot. The rest were led to the graves, where the firing squads awaited them. Friedrich Jeckeln, the higher SS and police leader in northern Russia, had developed an execution method that he called sardine packing. Victims were forced to lie face down in the grave, side by side, and then were executed with shots to the back of the neck. The next row of victims had to lie on top of the bodies of the newly executed, and so on. This method allowed to maximize the use of space in the graves and minimize the time required for each execution. Jeckeln personally supervised the Rumbula massacres, walking among the graves, giving instructions to the executors, ensuring that everything went according to plan. After the war, he was captured by the Soviets, tried in Riga, and hanged in February of 1946. But his execution method had already been adopted by other SS commanders and used in massacres all over the Eastern Front. How is it possible that human beings could develop and perfect methods to murder other human beings with such efficiency? What psychological processes allowed apparently normal people to become mass murderers? Historians and psychologists have debated these questions for decades. Some argue that the perpetrators were ordinary people who were transformed by circumstances, peer pressure, obedience to authority, the gradual dehumanization of the victims. Others maintain that many of the executors were convinced ideologues who genuinely believed in the need to exterminate the Jews. The reality probably includes both factors and many more. What we do know is that the Nazi regime developed sophisticated techniques to facilitate participation in the massacres. The division of labor was one of them. Instead of a single person being responsible for the entire execution process, tasks were divided among multiple individuals. Some gathered the victims, others transported them, others forced them to undress, others fired, others covered the graves. This allowed each participant to concentrate only on their small part of the process, avoiding confronting the totality of what was occurring. Language also played a crucial role. The Nazis developed a euphemistic vocabulary to refer to the executions. They did not speak of murders or massacres, but of special actions, special treatment, resettlement, evacuation to the east. This coded language not only served to maintain secrecy, but also to create a psychological distance between the perpetrators and their actions. And then there was the alcohol, abundant, almost mandatory. Before, during, and after the executions, the executioners drank. Vodka flowed in industrial quantities, provided by the regime itself. It was a way to numb consciences, to allow men who in normal circumstances would never have been able to shoot a woman or a child to be able to do it repeatedly, day after day, week after week. But not all the executors needed alcohol to fulfill their duty. Some enjoyed it. The testimonies of survivors, and the reports of the perpetrators themselves reveal cases of extreme sadism. Guards who raped women before executing them, who tortured prisoners for fun, who made bets on how many people they could kill in a day. These individuals, perhaps having always had sadistic tendencies, found that the context of the war and total impunity allowed them to express them without restrictions. But the most disturbing thing is that these sadists were the exception, not the rule. Most of the perpetrators were not monsters in a psychological sense. They were bureaucrats of murder, functionaries who did their jobs with the same diligence with which they might have processed forms in an office. And that banality, that everyday nature of evil, is perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. While the massacres continued in the occupied territories, decisions were being made in Berlin that would determine the fate of millions more. On the 20th of January of 1942, 15 high-ranking officials of the Nazi regime met in a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, on the outskirts of the German capital. The meeting, which would go down in history as the Wannsee Conference, lasted barely 90 minutes. But in that brief time, the plans were established for what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish question. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the video's engagement, okay? Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube continues to recommend our videos to you. Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, chaired the meeting. With chilling bureaucratic efficiency, he presented statistics on the Jewish population of Europe, country by country, and outlined the plans for their evacuation to the east. Everyone present understood that evacuation was a euphemism for extermination. The notable thing about the Wannsee Conference is not that the decision to exterminate the Jews of Europe was made. That decision had already been made months before, implicitly, through the actions of the Einsatzgruppen and other perpetrators. The notable thing is that the conference formalized and coordinated those efforts, involving multiple ministries and agencies of the German government in the process. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, all would have a role to play in the machinery of death. Adolf Eichmann, the SS lieutenant colonel who organized the logistics of the conference and took the minutes, would later remember that the participants discussed the methods of extermination with the same calmness with which they might have discussed any other administrative matter. There were no moral objections, no hesitations, no uncomfortable questions, only the cold efficiency of bureaucrats planning a genocide. But what about Hitler? Where was the Führer while his subordinates planned the greatest crime in history? Here we encounter one of the most debated mysteries of the historiography of the Holocaust. There is no document signed by Hitler explicitly ordering the extermination of the Jews. There is no audio recording where he expresses such an order. There are not even first-hand testimonies of anyone who heard Hitler personally give the order to begin the killings. Does this mean that Hitler was not responsible? Not at all. Historians agree that the Holocaust could not have occurred without the knowledge and approval of the dictator, but Hitler operated through what scholars have called charismatic leadership. Instead of giving specific orders, he established general guidelines and let his subordinates compete to interpret them and carry them out in the most radical way possible. This leadership technique, known as working towards the Führer, created a dynamic where Nazi officials were constantly trying to anticipate Hitler's wishes and outdo each other in their ideological zeal. No one wanted to seem less committed to the cause than their colleagues, and so the radicalization fed on itself, pushing the regime toward ever greater extremes. In the case of the Holocaust, this dynamic meant that Hitler never had to give an explicit order. His public speeches, his private comments, his clearly expressed ideology all indicated what he wanted. His subordinates simply competed to make that vision a reality in the most efficient way possible. But there were times when Hitler intervened directly in extermination policies. And some of those moments took place on the Eastern Front. In the fall of 1941, while the Einsatzgruppen were carrying out their massacres, a debate arose within the Nazi regime about the fate of German Jews and those of Western Europe. Some officials argued that these Jews, unlike the Jews of the East, were more assimilated, and that their extermination could cause diplomatic or public opinion problems. Others maintained that there should be no exceptions. All Jews, regardless of their origin, had to be eliminated. Hitler resolved the debate in a characteristic way, without giving a written order, but making his position clear. In November of 1941, in a private conversation with the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, Hitler declared that when German troops reached the Caucasus, the moment would have arrived for the destruction of the Jewish elements living in the Arab sphere. And in December, in a speech to the leaders of the Nazi Party, he declared that the world war he had predicted was now underway, and that its consequence would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. These declarations, although they did not constitute formal orders, sent a clear message to all levels of the regime. The Führer wanted the total destruction of the Jews, and his subordinates rushed to comply. On the Eastern Front, this translated into an intensification of the killings. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Einsatzgruppen expanded their operations to include not only Jewish men of military age, as had been the initial focus, but also women, children, and the elderly. The policy of extermination became total, but the secret executions on the Eastern Front were not limited to the Jews. Another group that suffered enormously were the Soviet prisoners of war. The history of the Soviet prisoners of war is one of the lesser-known tragedies of the Second World War. Of the approximately 5,700,000 Soviet soldiers who were captured by the Germans during the conflict, more than 3 million died in captivity. That is to say, more than 57% of all Soviet prisoners of war did not survive. To put it in perspective, the mortality rate for British and American prisoners of war in German hands was approximately 3.6%. Why such a dismal difference? The answer lies in Nazi ideology and the specific policies implemented on the Eastern Front. From the beginning of the campaign, Hitler had made it clear that Soviet soldiers would not be treated as conventional prisoners of war. They were not protected by the Geneva Conventions, which the Soviet Union had not signed, although this was a pretext rather than a legitimate reason. They did not deserve humane treatment. They were, according to Nazi propaganda, subhumans who only deserved death or slavery. The policies that resulted from this mentality were devastating. Soviet prisoners were confined in open-air camps, without adequate shelter during the brutal Russian winter. They received food rations completely insufficient to sustain life, often only a few hundred calories a day. They had no access to medical care. Diseases, especially typhus, spread unchecked. Many died simply of starvation and cold. But in addition to these deaths by deliberate negligence, there were also systematic executions of Soviet prisoners of war. The aforementioned Commissar order established that all captured political commissars were to be executed immediately. But the definition of commissar was interpreted extremely broadly, and in practice, any prisoner who looked suspicious could be classified as such. Furthermore, the Einsatzgruppen conducted regular selections in the prisoner of war camps, looking for Jews, intellectuals, communist agitators, and any other individual considered dangerous. Those who were selected were taken to isolated locations and executed. No records were kept of these executions. The prisoners simply disappeared. One of the most notorious sites of these executions was the Stalag 352 camp near Minsk. Established in July of 1941, the camp came to house more than 100,000 prisoners in absolutely inhuman conditions. The prisoners were confined in pits dug into the ground, without a roof, exposed to the elements. Food was so scarce that some prisoners resorted to cannibalism to survive. Executions were frequent and arbitrary. It is estimated that more than 80,000 Soviet prisoners died in Stalag 352 during the German occupation. The majority died of starvation, disease, or cold, but thousands were executed, especially those identified as Jews or commissars. And who ordered these executions? Once again, we find the same pattern of diffuse responsibility. The orders came from above, from Berlin, from Hitler and Himmler. But they were transmitted through multiple intermediaries. They were interpreted locally. They were implemented with varying degrees of zeal depending on the individual commanders. The result was a system where everyone was responsible and no one was responsible. A system designed for mass murder without leaving clear footprints. But the footprints existed, and after the war, investigators began to uncover them. The Nuremberg trial, which began in November of 1945, was the first systematic attempt to document Nazi crimes and bring those responsible to justice. Although the main defendants at Nuremberg were the political and military leaders of the regime, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others, the tribunal also established important legal precedents that would be used in subsequent trials against lower-ranking perpetrators. One of the most significant cases was the so-called Einsatzgruppen trial, which took place in Nuremberg between 1947 and 1948. 24 Einsatzgruppen officers were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The very reports of the Einsatzgruppen, which had been preserved in the Nazi archives, documented in bureaucratic detail the massacres they had perpetrated. These reports, known as Operational Situation Reports, Ereignismeldungen, were sent regularly to Berlin and summarized the actions carried out by each Einsatzgruppe. They included precise numbers of victims, broken down by category, Jews, communists, partisans, etc., and by location. It was, in effect, an accounting of murder, maintained with the same meticulousness with which a company might keep its financial records. For the prosecutors at Nuremberg, these documents were pure gold. They irrefutably demonstrated the systematic and planned nature of the executions. They showed that it was not a matter of individual excesses or spontaneous actions, but a deliberate policy implemented on a grand scale. 14 of the defendants in the Einsatzgruppen trial were sentenced to death, although only 4 of the sentences were finally carried out due to commutations made during the Cold War. Others received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Many were released prematurely in the following years, benefiting from amnesties and the changing political situation. But the Nuremberg trials were only the beginning. Over the following decades, investigators, historians, and Nazi hunters continued documenting the crimes of the Eastern Front and searching for the perpetrators who had escaped justice. One of the most dramatic cases was that of Adolf Eichmann, the SS bureaucrat who had organized the logistics of the Holocaust. After the war, Eichmann escaped to Argentina, where he lived under a false identity for 15 years. He was captured by Israeli Mossad agents in May of 1960 and taken to Israel to stand trial. Eichmann's trial, which took place in Jerusalem in 1961, was a global media event. For the first time, the Holocaust was presented in detail to a global audience, with hundreds of survivors testifying about their experiences. The trial also raised fundamental questions about the nature of evil and individual responsibility in systems of oppression. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial for the New Yorker magazine, coined the famous phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe Eichmann. In her view, Eichmann was not a sadistic monster or an ideological fanatic, but a mediocre bureaucrat who had committed atrocious crimes simply because it was his job. This interpretation generated enormous controversy and continues to be debated today. Eichmann was found guilty and executed by hanging in June of 1962. Until the day of his death, he insisted that he had only been following orders. But not all perpetrators were brought to justice. Many of the lower-ranking executors, those who had fired the bullets and dug the graves, were never prosecuted. Some returned to their normal lives after the war, working as farmers, merchants, or civil servants. They kept silent about what they had done, and their communities never asked. Others escaped to third world countries, especially in South America, where they found refuge in regimes sympathetic to Nazism. The so-called ratlins, the escape routes used by Nazi criminals, allowed thousands of perpetrators to evade justice for decades. How many mass murderers lived long and quiet lives, dying of old age in their beds while their victims lay in unmarked graves? It is a question that defies any sense of justice. But the story does not end with the trials and the escapes, because even decades after the events, we continue to discover new evidence about the secret executions on the Eastern Front. The Soviet archives, which were closed during the Cold War, opened after the fall of the Soviet Union, revealing documents that shed new light on the Nazi crimes. Forensic archaeology teams have located mass graves that had remained hidden for half a century. Survivors who kept silent for decades finally began to tell their stories. One of the most significant discoveries of recent years was the identification of numerous execution sites in Belarus that had not been previously documented. Investigators from the Holocaust Center of the organization Yahad in Unum, led by Father Patrick Desbois, have interviewed thousands of local witnesses and located hundreds of mass graves throughout Eastern Europe. Desbois' method is simple but effective. He visits towns and villages that were scenes of massacres during the war, looks for elderly people who were children or teenagers at that time, and asks them to tell what they remember. Many of these witnesses had never been interviewed before. Some witnessed the executions from their homes or fields. Others were forced to participate in the process, digging graves or transporting bodies. Their testimonies, combined with archaeological investigations, have allowed events to be reconstructed that otherwise would have been forgotten. What compels these witnesses to speak after so many years? For some, it is a desire for justice, for the dead to be remembered. For others, it is simply the relief of sharing a burden they have carried their entire lives. One of the interviewees by Desbois, an elderly Ukrainian man who had been forced to dig graves when he was a teenager, said, "I have waited 70 years for someone to ask me what I saw." The investigations of Yahad in Unum and other groups have revealed the true scale of what historians call the Holocaust by bullets, the mass executions carried out on the Eastern Front before the extermination camps with gas chambers became fully operational. It is estimated that approximately 1 in a million Jews were murdered in this manner in Ukraine alone. The figures for Belarus, the Baltic countries, and other regions of the Eastern Front raise the total to more than 2 million. But beyond the numbers, what these investigations have revealed are individual stories that give a face and a name to the victims. Stories like that of the Kogan family from Berdichev, a Ukrainian city where more than 20,000 Jews were murdered in a series of massacres between August and November of 1941. The Kogans were a family of merchants who had lived in Berdichev for generations. When the Germans arrived, they tried to hide in the basements of Ukrainian neighbours, but they were betrayed and handed over to the executioners. None survived. Or the story of Motel Braverman, a 12-year-old boy from a small village in Belarus. Motel managed to escape a massacre by hiding under the bodies of his family. He remained in the grave all night, covered in blood, listening to the groans of the dying. At dawn, when the Germans left, he crawled out of the grave and fled into the forest, where he found a group of partisans who took him in. He survived the war and emigrated to Israel, where he lived until his death in 2014 at the age of 85. But he could never erase the images of that night from his memory. Stories like these are repeated thousands of times across the Eastern Front. Every town, every city, every village has its own tales of tragedy, and every mass grave holds the remains of people who were torn from their lives without prior warning, without explanation, without the opportunity to say goodbye. How do we process this suffering? How do we find meaning in what appears to be absolute meaninglessness? For many survivors and descendants of victims, the answer has been remembrance. Preserving the memory of the dead has become a sacred obligation, an act of resistance against the oblivion that the Nazis so desired. The monuments, the museums, the recorded testimonies, the memorial plaques, all form part of an effort to ensure that what happened is never forgotten. But remembrance is not enough if it is not accompanied by understanding. And understanding how it was possible for millions of people to be murdered in the centre of European civilization in the middle of the 20th century requires examining not only the actions of the Nazis, but also the conditions that made their rise to power and the implementation of their genocidal policies possible. How did a country with a rich cultural, philosophical, and scientific tradition come to commit the most atrocious crimes in history? What social, economic, and political factors created the breeding ground for Nazism? And what are the lessons we must extract to prevent something similar from happening again? These questions take us beyond the history of the secret executions on the Eastern Front, toward a broader reflection on human nature, moral responsibility, and the fragility of civilization. But before we delve into those deep waters, we must complete our journey through the concrete events, because there are aspects of the secret executions that we have not yet explored. There are stories that we have not yet told, and there are questions that we have not yet formulated. For example, what role did the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, play in the executions? For a long time, a myth existed that the Wehrmacht had been a clean institution, that it had fought a conventional war, while the atrocities were committed exclusively by the SS and other Nazi organizations. This myth, known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, was actively promoted by former German officers after the war and was accepted for decades by many Western historians. But investigations conducted since the 1980s have completely demolished this myth. The Wehrmacht was not only aware of the mass executions occurring on the Eastern Front, it actively participated in them. It provided logistical support to the Einsatzgruppen, cordoned off execution areas, transported victims, and in many cases its own units carried out the shootings. The Commissar Order, which mandated the execution of captured Soviet political commissars, was implemented by the Wehrmacht, not by the SS. The army commanders received the order and, with very few exceptions, obeyed it. It is estimated that between 40,000 and 100,000 commissars and other prisoners were executed by Wehrmacht units pursuant to this order. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht implemented anti-partisan warfare policies that in practice served as a cover for massacres of civilians. Under the pretext of fighting Soviet partisans, the Wehrmacht carried out operations that were in reality massacres of civilians disguised as legitimate military actions. What exactly did anti-partisan warfare mean in the context of the Eastern Front? In theory, it was about operations against irregular combatants who attacked German supply lines and sabotaged the Nazi war machine. But in practice, the definition of partisan was so broad that it could include anyone the Germans wanted to eliminate. Villagers who had supposedly given refuge to partisans, entire families suspected of sympathizing with the resistance, Jewish communities accused, without any evidence, of collaborating with Soviet guerrillas. The numbers are revealing. In Belarus, where partisan activity was particularly intense, the Germans carried out hundreds of anti-partisan operations between 1941 and 1944. The official result of these operations, according to the Germans' own reports, was the death of more than 345,000 partisans and the destruction of more than 5,000 villages. But when historians have examined these numbers closely, they have discovered something disturbing. The ratio between weapons captured and partisans eliminated was absurdly low. In many operations, hundreds or thousands of dead partisans were reported, but only a few dozen weapons recovered. What kind of guerrillas fight without weapons? The answer, of course, is that they were not guerrillas. They were unarmed civilians, many of them women, children, and the elderly, who were massacred under the convenient label of anti-partisan struggle. But why did the Wehrmacht participate in these crimes? Was it not supposed to be a professional army, heir to Prussian military traditions? Here we enter one of the most complex and disturbing aspects of the history of the Eastern Front. The short answer is that the Wehrmacht participated because it was ordered to do so, because Nazi ideology had permeated its ranks, and because the very nature of the war in the East created conditions that facilitated brutality. But there is a longer, more nuanced answer that reveals the internal tensions within the German army. Not all Wehrmacht officers accepted the criminal orders with the same enthusiasm. Some implemented them with fanatical zeal. Others complied with reluctance, as a disagreeable but inevitable duty. And a few, very few, refused to participate or even protested. One of the most notable cases of resistance within the Wehrmacht was that of General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of the German army in Poland during the early months of the war. Blaskowitz wrote several memorandums protesting against the atrocities committed by the SS and the police in Polish territory. He argued that these crimes were not only morally repugnant, but also damaged the discipline and prestige of the army. His protests reached Hitler, who dismissed them with contempt, calling Blaskowitz sentimental and unfit for command in the East. Blaskowitz was removed from his post in Poland, but was not punished more severely. He continued to serve on other fronts for the remainder of the war. His case illustrates both the possibility of resistance and its limits. Protesting could cost you your career, but rarely cost you your life, as long as you didn't go too far. Why then did so few protest? Why did the majority of the Wehrmacht officers and soldiers simply obey? The reasons are multiple and complex. Ideological indoctrination played an important role. During the years of the Nazi regime, anti-Semitic and anti-Slavic propaganda had permeated all German institutions, including the army. Many soldiers genuinely believed that Jews and communists were mortal enemies of Germany, and that their elimination was necessary for the survival of the nation. Fear was also a factor. Disobeying orders in wartime could result in court-martial and execution. Although in practice the penalties for refusing to participate in executions were less severe than many believed, the fear of the consequences was real and effective. And then there was peer pressure, the desire not to appear weak or cowardly in front of comrades, the need to belong. In the heat of battle, in the extreme conditions of the Eastern Front, these psychological factors could overcome the moral inhibitions that in normal circumstances would have prevented ordinary people from committing atrocities. But perhaps the most important factor was the systematic dehumanization of the enemy. Nazi propaganda had represented Slavs and Jews as subhumans, as vermin, as an existential threat that had to be exterminated. When you see another human being not as a person but as a plague, the moral barriers against violence crumble. How did this dehumanization manifest itself in the daily practice of the war? The testimonies of German soldiers, compiled both during and after the war, revealed chilling attitudes. Many spoke of killing Jews or Soviet civilians with the same indifference with which they would speak of killing rats. Some even took photographs of the executions as souvenirs, as if they were hunting trophies. These photographs, many of which have survived, show German soldiers posing smiling next to bodies of victims, sometimes even holding the corpses in grotesque postures. What do these images tell us about the psychology of the perpetrators? How is it possible that human beings could pose for photos next to people they had just murdered? Psychologists have studied these behaviors for decades, attempting to understand the mental mechanisms that permit such atrocities. One theory is that of moral disengagement, where perpetrators convince themselves that their actions are justified by a higher cause, that the victims somehow deserve their fate, or that they themselves are mere instruments of larger forces beyond their control. Another theory emphasizes the importance of the situational context. In extreme conditions, with authorities sanctioning the violence and the social group reinforcing it, people who in normal circumstances would never commit violent acts can be transformed into murderers. It is what psychologist Philip Zimbardo has called the Lucifer effect, the capacity of malignant systems to corrupt ordinary individuals. But these theories, although useful, cannot completely capture the reality of what occurred on the Eastern Front, because alongside the perpetrators who killed with indifference or even with pleasure, there were others who suffered deeply because of what they did. Soldiers who vomited after the executions, officers who drowned themselves in alcohol to numb their consciences, men who returned home after the war and could never speak of what they had seen and done. The psychological cost of participating in atrocities was real, although it is rarely discussed. The perpetrators were not immune to suffering, they simply expressed it in different ways. Some developed psychosomatic disorders, physical illnesses without apparent medical cause. Others fell into deep depressions. A few took their own lives. Is it possible to feel compassion for the perpetrators? This is a question that has divided philosophers, historians, and survivors for generations. Some argue that any attempt to understand or humanize the perpetrators amounts to excusing their crimes. Others maintain that only by understanding how ordinary people became murderers can we prevent something similar from happening again. What is indisputable is that the suffering of the perpetrators, however real it was, cannot be compared in any sense with the suffering of their victims. The executioners had choices, albeit limited. The victims had none. But let us return to the chronology of events, because while these moral and psychological debates are important, we must not lose sight of the concrete reality of what occurred. The year 1942 marked an intensification of the secret executions on the Eastern Front. After the Wannsee Conference in January, the Nazi extermination apparatus entered a new phase, more systematic, more efficient, more deadly. In Ukraine, the massacres continued at an accelerated pace. After Babi Yar, there were dozens of other mass executions in cities and towns throughout the country. In Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, approximately 15,000 Jews were murdered in a series of operations between December of 1941 and January of 1942. The methods were the same as in Kyiv: gathering, transportation, shooting, mass grave. Only the names of the places and the victims changed. In Odessa, occupied by Romanian troops allied with Germany, the situation was equally brutal. After an attack that killed several Romanian officers in October of 1941, the occupation authorities unleashed a wave of reprisals that left tens of thousands dead. The Jews of Odessa were the primary targets. It is estimated that between 25,000 and 34,000 people were murdered in the days immediately following the attack. Thousands more were deported to camps in Transnistria, where they died of starvation, disease, or execution. Did you know that Romania was responsible for more Jewish deaths than any other ally of Germany? Approximately between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews were murdered in territory controlled by Romania during the war. This figure includes not only Romanian Jews, but also Ukrainian and Moldovan Jews, who fell under Romanian occupation. The Romanian case illustrates an aspect frequently forgotten of the genocide. It was not exclusively German. Although the initiative and direction came from Berlin, the implementation depended largely on local collaborators. In every occupied country, the Nazis found people willing to participate in the executions, whether out of ideological conviction, opportunism, fear, or a mixture of all these motivations. In Ukraine, Ukrainian auxiliary police units actively participated in the massacres. In the Baltic countries, as we have already seen, local collaborators were responsible for many of the worst atrocities. In Croatia, the puppet regime of the Ustaš carried out its own genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Romani with a brutality that sometimes shocked even the Nazis themselves. This local collaboration raises uncomfortable questions about collective responsibility. To what extent were these collaborators victims themselves of the circumstances, caught between the German occupation and their own historical resentments? And to what extent were they willing perpetrators who took advantage of the opportunity to act upon their own prejudices? The answers vary depending on the individual case, but what is clear is that the genocide would not have been possible at the scale it reached without the active participation of thousands of local collaborators. The Germans simply did not have enough personnel to carry out the executions on their own. They needed help, and they found it. But there was also resistance. In every occupied country, there were individuals and groups who refused to collaborate, who hid Jews, who sabotaged the extermination operations. These righteous among the nations, as the Yad Vashem Memorial has called them, risked their lives and those of their families to save strangers. Their stories, although less known than those of the perpetrators, are a testament that even in the most extreme circumstances, moral choice remains possible. What led some people to risk everything to save others, while their neighbours participated in the killings or simply looked the other way? Studies on rescuers have identified some common factors. Many had a strong sense of individuality, a capacity to think for themselves independently of social pressures. Many had prior contact with Jews and saw them as people, not as abstractions. Some were motivated by religious beliefs or deeply ingrained moral principles. But ultimately, there is no single profile of the rescuer. People of all backgrounds, social classes, and educational levels became saviours. What united them was the decision to act according to their conscience, regardless of the cost. These stories of rescue, although inspiring, should not make us forget the statistical reality. The rescuers were the exception, not the rule. For every person who risked their life to save a Jew, there were dozens who did nothing, and some who actively participated in the persecution. But let us return to the main thread of our narrative, because there are aspects of the secret executions of the Eastern Front that we have not yet explored. One of the most disturbing is the fate of the children. How did the Nazi regime treat the most vulnerable members of the populations it had marked for destruction? The answer is brutal in its simplicity. Jewish children were murdered along with their parents, without exception, without mercy. The Nazi logic was implacable. If children were allowed to survive, they might grow up to avenge their parents. Furthermore, in the Nazi racial vision, Jewish contamination was transmitted through blood, so even the youngest children were considered a threat to the purity of the Aryan race. Testimonies of the executions describe scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Mothers trying to protect their children with their own bodies, children crying, confused, not understanding why they were being killed, babies torn from their mothers' arms and thrown alive into the graves. Executioners who, unable to shoot small children, killed them by bashing their heads against trees or walls. How can we process such horrors? How do we find words to describe what defies all description? Perhaps we cannot. Perhaps the only thing we can do is bear witness, preserve the names and the stories of the victims, ensure that they are not forgotten. In Belarus, there existed a particularly tragic phenomenon known as the burned villages. During anti-partisan operations, the Germans did not limit themselves to executing the inhabitants suspected of collaborating with the resistance. They destroyed entire communities, burning the houses with the people still inside. The most well-known case is that of Katyn, a small village in the Minsk region. On the 22nd of March of 1943, a German police battalion surrounded the town. All the inhabitants, 149 people, were locked in a barn. Then the barn was set on fire. Those who tried to escape the flames were shot dead. Only 3 people survived, 2 of them children. Why Katyn? What had this small village done to deserve such destruction? Officially, the operation was a reprisal for a partisan attack that had killed several German soldiers in the area the day before. But the reality was that the inhabitants of Katyn had no proven connection to the partisans. They simply had the bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The village was chosen almost at random, as an example to terrorize the local population and deter them from supporting the resistance. Katyn became, after the war, a symbol of Nazi atrocities in Belarus. A memorial was built on the site, with a sculpture of the only adult who survived holding the body of his dead son. But Katyn was only one of more than 5,000 Belarusian villages that were totally or partially destroyed during the German occupation. Some were never rebuilt. Their names exist only in the archives and in the memory of the survivors. Can you imagine what it means to lose not only your family, but your entire community, everyone you knew, the whole world you had inhabited? Belarus paid a particularly high price during the Second World War. It is estimated that between 25 and 30% of the country's population died during the conflict, the highest proportion of any nation. Of the approximately 9 million inhabitants Belarus had before the war, between 2 and 3 million did not survive. This figure includes soldiers fallen in combat, civilians dead in bombings and famines, and of course, the victims of the secret executions. The devastation was so complete that it fundamentally altered the demography and culture of the country. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were wiped from the face of the earth. Villages that had been home to generations disappeared without a trace. The social fabric of entire regions was destroyed. And yet, even in these desperate circumstances, there was resistance. Belarusian partisans became one of the most effective resistance forces in occupied Europe. Operating from the vast forests and swamps of the country, they carried out sabotages, ambushes, and attacks that caused considerable problems for the German occupiers. But resistance had a cost. Every partisan attack provoked brutal reprisals against the civilian population. The Germans applied a policy of collective responsibility. For every dead German soldier, dozens or hundreds of civilians were executed. This policy placed the partisans in an impossible moral position. Was it worth attacking the Germans if it meant that innocent villagers would be massacred in reprisal? Some partisan commanders took this consideration into account and limited their operations to protect the civilian population. Others argued that the only way to defeat the Nazis was to keep fighting, regardless of the cost. And the civilians themselves were divided. Some supported the partisans and accepted the risks. Others feared them as much as the Germans, knowing their presence would draw reprisals. This moral complexity is often forgotten in simplified narratives of the war. The reality was much more ambiguous, more difficult, more painful than any heroic tale can capture. But there is another aspect of the secret executions of the Eastern Front that we must examine: the efforts of the Nazi regime to hide its crimes. Why did the Nazis care about secrecy if they believed that what they were doing was justified? This is a fascinating question that reveals the internal contradictions of the regime. On the one hand, Nazi ideology held that the elimination of the Jews was necessary and correct, an act of racial cleansing that would benefit humanity. On the other hand, Nazi leaders knew that the outside world, and even many Germans, would not accept what they were doing if they knew. This tension was reflected in the language used. As we have already mentioned, the Nazis developed a euphemistic vocabulary to refer to their executions. But even this coded language was sometimes considered too explicit. In some documents, references to the massacres are so vague that they can only be understood with knowledge of the context. The concern for secrecy was also manifested in the instructions given to the perpetrators. They were ordered not to speak of what they did, not to take photographs, an order which, as we have seen, many ignored, not to leave written records beyond the official reports. Participants in the executions often had to sign confidentiality pledges. And what about the victims who could have given testimony? The Nazi policy was simple: there should be no survivors. Every execution had to be complete, leaving no witnesses who could tell what they had seen. But despite all these efforts, the information leaked. German soldiers wrote letters to their families describing what they had witnessed. Officials with access to secret reports shared information with contacts abroad. And of course, Some Jews managed to escape the massacres and lived to tell their story. One of the most important sources of information about the Holocaust, while it was still happening, was the so-called Karski report. Jan Karski was an officer in the Polish army who became a messenger for the resistance. In 1942, Karski was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp where he could witness the conditions in which the Jews lived. He then escaped from Poland and travelled to London and Washington, where he met with political leaders to inform them about what was occurring. The reaction of these leaders was, at best, tepid. Many simply could not believe what Karski was telling them. It seemed to them too monstrous, too far removed from any known human experience. Others, perhaps, did not want to believe because believing would have implied the obligation to act. The American President Franklin Roosevelt received Karski at the White House in July of 1943. He listened to his report carefully, but took no specific action to stop or mitigate the genocide. Military priorities, argued the president's advisors, had to take precedence. The best way to help the Jews was to win the war as quickly as possible. Was this correct? Could more have been done to save lives while the genocide was still ongoing? These questions have been intensely debated by historians. Some argue that the Allied powers could have bombed the railways leading to the extermination camps, interrupting the flow of victims. Others maintain that such bombings would have been technically difficult and of doubtful effectiveness. What is clear is that saving the Jews of Europe was never a priority for the Allies. The genocide continued without significant obstacles until the Allied armies finally liberated the camps. But let's return to the Eastern Front, where the executions continued, while the world looked the other way. As the war progressed and military fortunes began to change, the Nazis intensified their efforts to erase the evidence of their crimes. We have already mentioned Operation 1005, Sonderaktion 1005, the program to exhume and burn the bodies from the mass graves. But this program was only part of a broader effort of evidence destruction. In the extermination camps, the Nazis dismantled the gas chambers and the crematoriums when they were forced to evacuate them. In the administration offices, documents were burned by the ton. In the SS headquarters, entire archives were destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. But they could not destroy everything. Some documents survived by accident, forgotten in corners of archives, hidden by officials who wanted to keep a record of what they had witnessed. Others were captured before they could be destroyed, when the Allied advance was faster than expected. And then there were the testimonies. No matter how much the Nazis tried to eliminate all the witnesses, there were always survivors, people who hid under the corpses and waited until their executioners left, people who were left for dead but miraculously survived their wounds, people who escaped before the executions began and took refuge in the forests. These survivors, whose voices were initially few, became the guardians of the memory. Their testimonies, collected in the years and decades following the war, have been fundamental to reconstructing what happened. One of the most important efforts to preserve these testimonies was the Shoah Foundation, created by filmmaker Steven Spielberg after the release of his film Schindler's List in 1993. The foundation has collected more than 55,000 video testimonies of survivors of the Holocaust and other genocides, creating an invaluable archive for future generations. But time is relentless. As the years pass, fewer and fewer survivors remain. The last generation of direct witnesses is disappearing. Soon, all that will be left will be the archives, the documents, the recordings. Will they be enough to keep the memory alive? This question leads us to reflect on the very purpose of remembering. Why is it important that we continue talking about the Holocaust and the secret executions on the Eastern Front, so many decades after the events? The most obvious answer is that we must remember to prevent something similar from happening again. Never again has become the motto of Holocaust commemoration, a commitment that humanity will not permit another genocide. But the history following the Second World War has demonstrated how difficult it is to fulfill that commitment Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. Genocides have continued to occur, despite everything we know about the Holocaust. It seems that memory, by itself, is not enough to prevent repetition. What else is needed then? Perhaps education, not only about the facts of the Holocaust, but about the psychological and social mechanisms that made it possible. Perhaps active vigilance against hate speech and the dehumanization of minority groups. Perhaps stronger international institutions capable of intervening when warning signs of genocide are detected. And perhaps also a deeper reflection on our own capacity for evil. Because one of the most disturbing lessons of the Holocaust is that the perpetrators were not monsters from another planet. They were human beings like us, with families, with dreams, with ordinary lives that were turned upside down by extraordinary circumstances. If they could become murderers, what does that tell us about ourselves? This is not a comfortable question. We prefer to think that there is a clear line separating good people from monsters, and that we are firmly on the right side of that line. But history suggests that the line is much blurrier than we would like to believe. Recognizing this does not mean excusing the perpetrators or minimizing their crimes. It means, rather, assuming a deeper responsibility for our own actions and those of our society. It means being alert to the signs of dehumanization and exclusion, even when they seem small and insignificant. It means remembering that the road to the abyss begins with small steps, not with giant leaps. But let us leave the general reflections for now and return to concrete history, because there are specific episodes of the secret executions on the Eastern Front that we have not yet explored and that deserve to be told. One of the lesser-known aspects of the genocide in the East was the extermination of the Romani people, a group that was also marked for destruction by Nazi ideology. The Romani, frequently called gypsies, a term many consider derogatory, had been the subject of discrimination and persecution in Europe for centuries. But under Nazism, this persecution turned into a policy of systematic extermination. It is estimated that between 220,000 and 500,000 Romani were murdered during the Holocaust, an event known in the Romani language as Porajmos, which means the devouring. The variation in the numbers reflects the difficulty of documenting these deaths. Many Romani lived in mobile communities without formal records, and their deaths were frequently uncounted. On the Eastern Front, the Romani were executed alongside the Jews by the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators. The reports of these units sometimes specifically mention gypsies as victims, although they were often simply included in broader categories such as social elements or spies. A particularly brutal example was the so-called Action Against the Gypsies in Crimea in December of 1941 and January of 1942. Einsatzgruppe D, under the command of Otto Ohlendorf, carried out a systematic campaign to locate and execute all the Romani on the peninsula. The methods were the same as for the Jews: gathering, transportation, shooting. But the Romani presented an additional challenge. Many were nomadic and were not concentrated in ghettos or communities that were easy to identify. The Germans had to rely on local informants to locate them. Why did the Nazis want to exterminate the Romani? Nazi racial ideology classified them as asocials and criminals by nature, a threat to the purity of German society. Some Nazi theorists argued that the Romani, although originally of Aryan origin, hailing from India, had become contaminated through centuries of mixing with inferior peoples. Others simply saw them as a social nuisance that had to be eliminated. What is particularly tragic about the Porajmos is that it has been largely ignored in the collective memory of the Second World War. For decades, the suffering of the Romani was eclipsed by the attention focused on the Jewish Holocaust. Only in recent years has it begun to receive the recognition it deserves. But there were other groups that were also victims of the secret executions on the Eastern Front. The mentally ill and disabled, for example, were systematically eliminated as part of the Nazi euthanasia program that had begun in Germany before the war. In the occupied territories of the East, This program was implemented with particular brutality. Psychiatric hospitals were emptied and their patients executed. In some cases, patients were killed by lethal injections or gas fans. In others, they were simply shot. A documented case is that of the psychiatric hospital in Mogilev in Belarus. In September of 1941, the Germans ordered the evacuation of all the patients of the hospital. Approximately 800 mentally ill people were transported to a nearby forest and executed. The doctors and nurses of the hospital were forced to collaborate in the operation, under the threat of being executed themselves. What justification did the Nazis offer for these murders? In the twisted logic of the regime, the mentally ill were life unworthy of life, a burden on society that consumed resources that could be better used for the healthy and productive. Furthermore, their existence supposedly weakened the genetic material of the nation. These ideas were not exclusively Nazi. They had roots in the eugenics movement that had gained popularity in many Western countries in the early 20th century, including the United States. But only in Nazi Germany were they taken to their final logical conclusion: the systematic murder of those considered defective. The history of the euthanasia program reveals the relationship between the different Nazi extermination policies. The same methods developed to kill the mentally ill, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematorium ovens to dispose of the bodies, were later adapted and perfected for the Holocaust. And many of the same perpetrators participated in both programs. But there is an important difference. The euthanasia program in Germany generated public protests, especially from religious leaders, which led to its official suspension in August of 1941, although it continued more covertly. In the occupied territories of the East, there were no such protests. The executions continued unimpeded, far from the eyes of German society. What does this tell us about the nature of resistance to evil? It seems to suggest that proximity matters. It is easier to protest against atrocities that happen near us, that affect people we know, that are visible in our daily lives. Distant, invisible atrocities can continue without generating the same reaction. This observation has disturbing implications for the contemporary world, where wars and genocides frequently occur in remote places, far from the attention of Western media. How many atrocities are happening right now, while we live our ordinary lives, without knowing or caring about what is happening? But let us return to the Eastern Front, where our story still has chapters left to tell. As the war progressed toward 1943 and 1944, Germany's military situation deteriorated rapidly. The defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943 marked a turning point. From then on, the German army was in retreat, gradually losing territory to the advance of the Red Army. This retreat posed a problem for the Nazis: what to do with the prisoners, the forced labourers, and the last Jews still remaining in the territories that were about to be liberated. The answer was a combination of forced evacuations and mass executions. In some cases, prisoners were forced to march west, into territory still under German control. These death marches claimed thousands of lives, as prisoners weakened by years of captivity and forced labour died of exhaustion, cold, or were executed if they could not keep up the pace. In other cases, when there was no time or resources to evacuate the prisoners, they were simply murdered before the arrival of the Soviet troops. Labour camps and prisons were liquidated, their inhabitants executed, and their facilities destroyed. One of the most dramatic examples of these last-minute executions occurred at the Ponary camp, near Vilna, current Vilnius, capital of Lithuania. Ponary had been the primary execution site for the Jews of Vilna. It is estimated that some 70,000 people were murdered there between 1941 and 1944. At the end of 1943, anticipating the arrival of the Red Army, the Germans ordered the exhumation and burning of the bodies buried at Ponary. For this task, they used a group of 80 Jewish prisoners, whom they kept chained and under constant surveillance. The prisoners knew they would be executed when the work was finished. For 3 months, these men carried out the macabre task of digging up and burning the remains of their compatriots, and in some cases, of their own families. While they worked, they planned an escape. With spoons and their bare hands, they dug a tunnel 35 meters long that led them outside the compound. On the night of the 15th of April of 1944, the prisoners escaped through the tunnel. The guards discovered the escape almost immediately and began to shoot. Of the 80 prisoners, only 12 managed to escape and survive, but those 12 became invaluable witnesses to what had happened at Ponary. Can you imagine the courage it took to plan that escape? The hope they had to keep alive while performing the most horrible work imaginable, knowing that each day could be their last. Stories of escape and survival like this are flashes of light in the darkness of the genocide. They remind us that even in the most desperate circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to resist, to fight, to live. But these stories also pose difficult questions. Why did some survive while millions died? Was it luck, skill, circumstances, or a combination of all? And what does it mean to survive something like that? For many survivors, survival came accompanied by a burden of guilt that they could never shake off. Why me and not my brother? Why me and not my wife? Why me and not the millions who died? These questions haunted them for the rest of their lives. Primo Levi, the Italian writer who survived Auschwitz, wrote extensively about this survivor's guilt. He argued that those who survived were not necessarily the best or the most worthy. They were often simply the ones who had the most luck, or those who were willing to do whatever was necessary to survive, even at the expense of others. This reflection, honest to the point of cruelty, reveals the moral complexity of survival in extreme conditions. But not all survivors experienced guilt. Some felt an obligation to bear witness, to speak on behalf of those who could not speak. Others simply moved on with their lives, building families, careers, futures, without looking back. Each survivor found their own way of living with what they had experienced. Continuing with our chronology, we arrive at the final months of the war. In 1945, as the Red Army advanced toward Berlin, it liberated one after another the sites of the greatest Nazi atrocities. Auschwitz was liberated on the 27th of January of 1945, a date now commemorated as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Other camps followed in the subsequent weeks and months. What the Soviet soldiers found defies all description. Mountains of corpses, survivors who looked like walking skeletons, evidence of the industrial methods of murder, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the piles of shoes, eyeglasses, human hair that the Nazis had stored for reuse. But they also found the mass graves of the Eastern Front. As the army advanced westward, it stumbled upon the sites of the massacres: Babi Yar, Rumbula, Ponary, and hundreds of other lesser-known places. The graves were exhumed, the bodies counted when possible, the crimes documented. The Soviets established commissions to investigate Nazi crimes in the liberated territories. These commissions gathered testimonies, photographs, documents, forensic evidence. Much of this material was used in the Nuremberg trials and in subsequent proceedings against Nazi war criminals. But the Soviet documentation also had limitations. For political reasons, Soviet authorities often minimized or ignored the specifically Jewish component of the genocide. Victims were described simply as Soviet citizens, without mentioning their ethnicity. The monuments erected at the sites of the massacres frequently omitted any reference to Jews. This policy of concealment continued for decades, until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why did the Soviet government want to hide the identity of the victims? The reasons are complex. Part of the explanation lies in communist ideology, which rejected ethnic or religious identities in favour of a universal class identity. According to this view, all Soviet citizens had suffered equally under Nazi occupation, and highlighting the particular suffering of the Jews would be divisive. But anti-Semitism was also at play. Despite the official rhetoric of equality, the Soviet Union had a long history of discrimination against Jews. which intensified in the final years of Stalin's regime. Acknowledging the genocide of the Jews would have meant recognizing the Jews as a distinct group with their own history and their own rights, something the regime preferred to avoid. The result was a strange paradox. The Nazis had murdered Soviet Jews precisely because they were Jews, but the Soviet government refused to acknowledge this fact. The victims were deprived of their identity twice, first by their murderers, then by their supposed liberators. This situation only began to change with the openness of the Gorbachev era in the late 1980s, and more dramatically after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Only then was free investigation of Nazi crimes in Soviet territories permitted, and only then did the Jewish victims begin to receive the recognition they deserved. The Soviet archives that opened after 1991 contained invaluable information about the secret executions on the Eastern Front. Reports from post-war investigation commissions, testimonies from survivors, documents captured from the Germans. All this material, which had been classified for decades, was suddenly available to historians. The discoveries were sometimes revealing, sometimes disturbing. Massacres that were only vaguely known were confirmed. Execution sites that had been forgotten were identified. Names of victims who had disappeared without a trace were found. But the archives also revealed uncomfortable aspects of Soviet history. The collaboration of some Soviet citizens with the Nazis, for example, had been a taboo subject during the Soviet era. The archives showed the extent of this collaboration, which had included not only auxiliary police and local officials, but also ordinary neighbours who had denounced hidden Jews or had appropriated their belongings. How do post-Soviet societies process this uncomfortable legacy? It is a question that remains relevant today, decades after the events. In some countries like Germany, there has been a sustained effort to confront the past, acknowledge the crimes, and assume collective responsibility. In others, like Lithuania or Ukraine, the process has been more complex, with continuous debates about the role of local collaborators and the way to remember the victims. But let us leave the historiographical complications and return to the individual stories, because in the end, the Holocaust and the secret executions on the Eastern Front were not abstract events. They were personal tragedies multiplied millions of times. Let me tell you the story of a family. The Shapiros lived in Pinsk, a city in what is now western Belarus. Before the war, Pinsk had a vibrant Jewish community of approximately 20,000 people, who constituted the majority of the city's population. The Shapiros had lived there for generations. The patriarch, Mordecai, was a fabric merchant. His wife Rivka managed the household. They had 5 children aged between 4 and 18 years old. When the Germans occupied Pinsk in July of 1941, the Shapiros' life changed overnight. They were forced to move into the newly established ghetto, a restricted area where the Jews of the city were crowded together in increasingly difficult conditions. Mordecai lost his business. The family survived on what they could trade on the black market. In August of 1941, the Germans carried out the first action in Pinsk. 8,000 Jews, mainly men, were taken out of the ghetto and executed on the outskirts of the city. Mordecai Shapiro was among them. Rivka was left alone with 5 children and no means of subsistence. During the following months, she struggled to keep her family alive, selling the few possessions they had left, working in forced labour brigades, depending on the charity of neighbours. In November of 1942, the Germans decided to liquidate the Pinsk ghetto. In an operation that lasted several days, the approximately 10,000 remaining Jews were taken from their homes, led to graves dug on the outskirts of the city, and executed. Rivka Shapiro and her 5 children died together, embracing in a mass grave that remains unmarked today. Of the entire Shapiro family, only a distant relative survived, who had escaped to the east before the German occupation, and who later emigrated to Israel. It was he who, decades later, reconstructed the family's story from the testimonies of other survivors from Pinsk. How many stories like this were lost forever? How many families were erased without a trace, without anyone to remember their names? This is the reality behind the numbers. Every single one of the millions who died was a person with a name, with a history, with interrupted dreams. And every death left a void that could never be filled. The destruction of entire Jewish communities also meant the destruction of cultures that had flourished for centuries. Yiddish, the language of the Jews of Eastern Europe, lost the majority of its speakers. The traditions, the songs, the stories, the ways of life that had been transmitted from generation to generation, disappeared along with those who carried them. In this sense, the Holocaust was a double crime, the murder of millions of individuals and the destruction of a civilization. What was lost was not just lives, but a whole world. But there is something else we must examine before concluding our exploration of the secret executions on the Eastern Front. And that is the legacy that these events left for subsequent generations. How did the trauma of the genocide affect the descendants of survivors and victims? Psychological studies have documented what is known as transgenerational trauma, the transmission of traumatic effects from one generation to the next. The children of Holocaust survivors, although they did not experience the atrocities directly, grew up in the shadow of their parents' trauma. Many report anxiety, depression, difficulties in forming close relationships, a persistent feeling of vulnerability. Some children of survivors have channeled this legacy into activism, dedicating their lives to Holocaust remembrance and the fight against anti-Semitism. Others have preferred to distance themselves from the past, building lives that avoid any reference to the genocide. And many have navigated a middle path, acknowledging the traumatic legacy, while attempting to live full and meaningful lives. But the legacy of the genocide does not only affect the descendants of the victims, it also marks the societies where the crimes occurred. In Germany, the process of confronting the Nazi past, known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, has been long and difficult. During the first decades of the post-war period, many Germans preferred not to talk about the subject. The guilt was too heavy, the shame too deep. Only in the 60s and 70s, with the emergence of a new generation demanding answers, did a more serious examination of the past begin. But there is something that we have still not explored with the depth it deserves. How exactly did the system of orders function that allowed these executions to be carried out? Who gave the instructions? And how did they ensure that they could never be traced back to Adolf Hitler? Here is where the story becomes truly fascinating and truly disturbing. The Nazi system of transmitting orders was deliberately opaque. Hitler rarely put his most radical desires in writing. Instead, he expressed his intentions vaguely, leaving his subordinates to interpret them and carry them out. This method, which historians have termed working towards the Führer, created a deliberately confusing chain of responsibility, where everyone was guilty and no one could be directly pointed to. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, was the principal intermediary in this system. It was he who translated Hitler's vaguely expressed desires into concrete directives for the SS and the Einsatzgruppen. And it was he who personally visited the zones of operations to supervise that the special tasks were being executed as expected. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, also played a crucial role. Under his direct supervision, the Einsatzgruppen operated in the occupied territories, receiving instructions that often arrived verbally, without leaving a documentary trail. But how do we know then what really happened if so many orders were verbal? The answer lies in the very reports of the Einsatzgruppen. Despite efforts to maintain secrecy, the Nazi bureaucratic apparatus could not help but document its achievements. The commanders of the Einsatzgruppen regularly sent reports to Berlin, known as Ereignismeldungen, or operational situation reports, which detailed the executions carried out, including precise figures of victims broken down by category and location. These reports, which the Nazis never imagined would fall into enemy hands, became the most compelling evidence of their crimes. In them, the commanders reported their successes with the same coldness with which a sales manager might report his quarterly numbers. One of the most chilling documents that survived the war is the so-called Jaeger Report. Karl Jaeger, commander of Einsatzkommando 3, kept a meticulous record of all the executions carried out by his unit in Lithuania. The report provides an almost daily tally of the liquidations, totaling 137,346 people murdered in more than 100 executions in 71 different locations. The report documents the exact date, the place, the number of victims, and their breakdown into categories: Jews, communists, criminals. Women were shot from the beginning, but initially in smaller numbers than the men. Children began to appear in the tally in mid-August, when 3,207 people were murdered in Rokiskis on the 15th and 16th of August of 1941. The most disturbing thing about the Jaeger report is its tone. There is no military justification for the majority of the murders. The people were executed simply because they were Jewish. At the end of the document, Jaeger wrote with evident satisfaction, "I can state today that the goal of solving the Jewish problem in Lithuania has been achieved by Einsatzkommando 3. There are no Jews left in Lithuania, apart from the working Jews and their families." In an annex from February of 1942, Jaeger increased the total number of victims to 138,272, broken down into 48,252 men, 55,556 women, and 34,464 children. Only 1,851 of the victims were not Jewish. Can you imagine the mentality required to document the murder of more than 34,000 children with the precision of an accountant? But the Jaeger report was not an anomaly. All the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen kept similar records. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppe D, reported that his unit alone had murdered approximately 90,000 people during his period of command. These reports served multiple purposes. They allowed the headquarters in Berlin to monitor the progress of the operations. They provided statistics that could be used to plan future actions. And perhaps most importantly, they established a record of the work performed that could be used to justify additional resources and personnel. The existence of these documents raises an intriguing question. Why did the Nazis keep such detailed records of their crimes if they wanted to keep them secret? The answer reveals one of the fundamental contradictions of the regime. On the one hand, the Nazis wanted to hide their atrocities from the outside world and from the German population itself. On the other hand, the Nazi bureaucracy was so obsessed with documentation and efficiency that it could not help but record everything it did. Furthermore, many perpetrators were genuinely proud of their work and wanted their achievements to be recorded. This contradiction manifested itself in sometimes absurd ways. The same officers who ordered their subordinates not to speak of the executions also ordered them to keep precise records of how many people they had killed. The secrecy was for the external public. Internally, the crimes were celebrated and documented. But let's return to the operational functioning of the Einsatzgruppen, because there are details that we have not yet explored. Each of the four main Einsatzgruppen was subdivided into smaller units, called Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos. The Sonderkommandos, special commands, typically operated in the areas immediately behind the battlefront, while the Einsatzkommandos, intervention commands, were in charge of securing the already conquered territories. Einsatzgruppe A, initially commanded by Franz Walter Stahlecker, operated in the Baltic states and northern Russia, attached to Army Group North. It included Sonderkommandos 1A and 1B, and Einsatzkommandos 2 and 3. Einsatzgruppe B, under the initial command of Arthur Naber, covered Belarus and Central Russia. Attached to Army Group Center, it included Sonderkommandos 7A and 7B, Einsatzkommandos 8 and 9, and a special force under Franz VI that was prepared to act in case Moscow was captured. Einsatzgruppe C, initially commanded by Otto Rasch, operated in northern and central Ukraine, attached to Army Group South. It included Sonderkommandos 4A, commanded by Paul Blobel, who would lead the Babi Yar massacre, and 4B, and Einsatzkommandos 5 and 6. Einsatzgruppe D, under the command of Otto Ohlendorf, covered Bessarabia, southern Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus, attached to the 11th Army. It included Sonderkommandos 10A and 10B, and Einsatzkommandos 11A, 11B, and 12. This organizational structure allowed for a systematic coverage of the vast conquered territories. Each subunit had responsibility over a specific zone and operated with considerable autonomy, always within the general parameters established by the general headquarters. But the Einsatzgruppen, despite their lethal efficiency, faced a fundamental problem. They did not have enough personal capacity to carry out the mass executions by themselves. The four main groups numbered approximately 3,000 personnel. How could 3,000 executioners murder millions of people? The answer lies in collaboration. The Einsatzgruppen did not operate in a vacuum. They worked in close coordination with multiple organizations. The battalions of the Order Police, Ordnungspolizei, Waffen-SS units, the Wehrmacht, and crucially, local auxiliaries recruited in the occupied territories. The battalions of the Order Police provided the additional manpower necessary to cordon off the execution zones, transport the victims, and participate in the shootings. These police units, composed mostly of older German men who had not been drafted for the regular army, became active participants in the genocide. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the executions on the Eastern Front was the role of the local collaborators. In every occupied country, the Nazis found people willing to participate in the massacres, whether out of ideological conviction, economic opportunism, prior resentments against the Jews, or simply out of fear. What drove these people to collaborate with the occupiers in the murder of their own neighbours? In Lithuania, for example, the Germans found enthusiastic collaborators among the nationalists who had suffered under the Soviet occupation from 1940 to 1941. Many Lithuanians blamed the Jews for the communist regime, a false but widespread association, and were ready to take revenge. Franz Walter Stahlecker, commander of Einsatzgruppe A, reported to his superiors that he had succeeded in setting in motion pogroms of considerable scale, using Lithuanian collaborators. However, he also noted that these pogroms did not occur spontaneously. They required secret assistance from the Germans to begin. In the early days of the German occupation, between the 23rd and 27th of June of 1941, 4,000 Jews were murdered in the streets of Kaunas and in nearby graves. These murders were perpetrated primarily by Lithuanians, with the Germans observing and photographing. In Latvia, the Araj Commando, led by Viktor Arajs, became one of the most lethal collaborationist units. Arajs, a former police officer turned fanatical anti-Semite, recruited former members of the army and the Latvian police, university students, and members of nationalist organizations. Together with Einsatzgruppe A, the Araj Commando murdered 2,300 Jews in Riga on the 6th and 7th of July of 1941. In 6 months, Arajs and his collaborators would have murdered approximately half of the Jewish population of Latvia. In Ukraine, Ukrainian auxiliaries played a key role in many of the worst massacres, including Babi Yar. Historian Peter Longerich considers it probable that the Wehrmacht, together with the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, incited the Lviv pogroms in July of 1941, during which between 8,500 and 9,000 Jews were murdered. Historian Haberer points out that both in the Baltic states and in Ukraine and Belarus, the Germans would not have been able to murder so many Jews so quickly without local help. The ratio of German order police to local auxiliaries was 1:10 in Ukraine and Belarus. In rural areas, the ratio reached 1:20. This means that the majority of Ukrainian and Belarusian Jews were murdered by other Ukrainians and Belarusians under the command of German officers. How do we process this reality? How do we understand that neighbours who had lived together for generations suddenly turned into executioners and victims? The explanations are multiple and none is completely satisfactory. The latent anti-Semitism in many of these societies, exacerbated by centuries of religious and nationalist propaganda, provided the breeding ground. The brutality of the prior Soviet occupation generated resentments that were channeled against the Jews as scapegoats. The disintegration of the social order during the war created conditions where the darkest impulses could be expressed without consequences. And economic opportunism also played a role. Collaborating with the Nazis offered opportunities to enrich oneself with the properties of the victims. But none of these explanations absolves the perpetrators. In every community, there were people who chose not to collaborate, who even risked their lives to protect their Jewish neighbours. The moral choice was always present, even in the most extreme circumstances. However, we must now examine an aspect that has been frequently minimised in the narratives of the genocide: the role of the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. For decades after the war, a carefully cultivated myth existed that the Wehrmacht had been a clean institution, that it had fought a conventional war while the atrocities were committed exclusively by the SS and other Nazi organisations. This myth, known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, was actively promoted by former German officers and was accepted for a long time by Western historians, who preferred to view the German army as a potential ally during the Cold War. But historical evidence has completely demolished this myth. The murders took place with the knowledge and support of the German army in the East. As ordered by Hitler, the Wehrmacht cooperated with the Einsatzgruppen, providing logistical support for their operations and participating in the mass killings. On the 10th of October of 1941, Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau drafted an order that was to be read to the entire Sixth Army on the Eastern Front. Known as the Severity Order, it established the official position of the army regarding the fight against Jewish Bolshevism. Field officers were fully aware of the extermination operations carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. The Wehrmacht tried to justify its considerable participation in the massacres as anti-partisan operations rather than as racist attacks. But historian Hillgruber wrote that this was simply an excuse. He stated that the German generals who claimed that the Einsatzgruppen were a necessary response against the partisans were lying, and maintained that the massacre of approximately 2,200,000 defenseless people for reasons of racist ideology cannot be justified. The cooperation between the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen was not occasional or accidental, it was systematic and planned. Each Einsatzgruppe was formally assigned to a specific army group: Einsatzgruppe A to Army Group North, B to Centre, C to South, and D to the 11th Army. This structure ensured tight coordination between conventional military operations and extermination operations. In the south, the Romanian army worked closely with Einsatzgruppe D to massacre Ukrainian Jews, murdering approximately 26,000 Jews in the Odessa massacre. But what exactly happened during a typical action of the Einsatzgruppen? How did the process of mass murder unfold? The testimonies of survivors, the confessions of perpetrators, and captured documents allow us to reconstruct the procedure in chilling detail. The process began with the arrival of the Einsatzgruppe in a town or city. Generally, this occurred shortly after regular German troops had secured the area. Sometimes, the Einsatzgruppen waited a few days to establish themselves. Other times, they acted almost immediately. The first step was to identify and register the local Jewish population. This was done with the help of municipal records, local collaborators who pointed out their neighbours, and sometimes through anonymous denunciations from people seeking to appropriate the properties of the victims. Once the victims were identified, orders were issued for them to present themselves at a specific location. The pretext varied: resettlement, registration, disinfection, labour. Sometimes they were simply ordered to appear without any explanation. Those who did not obey were searched for house by house and dragged out by force. The victims were then led, on foot or in trucks, towards the execution site. This was usually located outside the town, in a forest, a ravine, an abandoned quarry, or any place that offered a certain degree of concealment. Sometimes the graves had already been dug in advance. Other times the victims themselves were forced to dig them. Upon arriving at the site, the victims were forced to hand over their belongings and to undress completely. Clothing and valuables were sorted and sent back to Germany to be redistributed. Nothing was wasted in the Nazi machinery of murder. Then came the execution itself. The methods varied depending on the unit and the circumstances. In some cases, the victims were lined up at the edge of the grave and shot by firing squads, the bodies falling directly into the hole. In other cases, a more efficient method was used, developed by Friedrich Jeckeln, the higher SS and police leader in northern Russia. Jeckeln's method, which he called sardine packing, consisted of forcing the victims to lie face down at the bottom of the grave, side by side, and then shooting them in the back of the neck. The next row of victims had to lie on top of the bodies of the recently executed, and so on. This method maximized the use of space in the graves and reduced the time required for each execution. Family members often witnessed the death of their loved ones before being executed themselves. Mothers held their children until the last moment. Husbands and wives died together, embracing. Small children, too young to understand what was happening, cried in confusion while they waited their turn. When the grave was filled, it was covered with dirt. Sometimes heavy machinery was used. Other times, the executors themselves, or prisoners forced to collaborate, shoveled the dirt over the bodies. In some cases, the earth moved for hours or days after the execution, indicating that some victims were still alive when they were buried. A member of Sonderkommando 4A, Anton Heidborn, later testified that 3 days after the Babi Yar massacre, there were still people alive among the corpses. How is it possible to describe such horror? How do we find words for what defies all description? Perhaps all we can do is bear witness, preserve the stories, ensure that the world never forgets. But there are aspects of their executions that we have not yet explored. What happened to the perpetrators after participating in these killings? How did the act of murdering defenseless people day after day affect their psyche? Historical sources reveal that the psychological consequences were significant, although rarely discussed openly. Many executioners resorted to alcohol to numb their consciences. Vodka flowed in industrial quantities before, during, and after the executions, provided by the regime itself, as a way to facilitate the process of killing. Some perpetrators developed disorders that we would identify today as post-traumatic stress, nightmares, insomnia, flashbacks, inability to function normally. A few suffered complete nervous breakdowns and had to be removed from service, and an undetermined but significant number took their own lives. It was precisely because of these psychological consequences that Himmler ordered the search for more humane methods of execution. Not more humane for the victims, of course, but for the executioners. The objective was to find ways to kill that created greater distance between the executioner and the victim. The technological solution that emerged was the mobile gas vans. These vehicles, known as Gaswagen, were modified trucks that channeled the engine's exhausted gases into the sealed rear compartment where the victims were crowded. The death process took between 15 and 30 minutes, during which the victims suffered an asphyxiating agony. From the perspective of the perpetrators, the gas vans offered several advantages. The driver did not see the victims die, he simply drove from one point to another. Those in charge of unloading the bodies did not participate in the act of killing itself. Responsibility was fragmented, allowing each participant to psychologically distance themselves from the final result. Gas vans were deployed extensively on the Eastern Front, starting in late 1941. However, they had significant limitations. They could only process a relatively small number of victims at a time, and the process of unloading the bodies continued to be traumatic for those who had to perform it. It was this pursuit of industrial efficiency in murder that eventually led to the development of the extermination camps, with fixed gas chambers, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and the most infamous of all, Auschwitz-Birkenau. But that is a different story, one that unfolded primarily outside the Eastern Front itself. In the East, mass shootings continued to be the main method of execution throughout the war. This reality has led historians to coin the term Holocaust by bullets to distinguish the genocide in the East from the industrialized genocide of the camps. The numbers are difficult to pinpoint with exactitude, but the most recent estimates suggest that the Einsatzgruppen, along with their associated units and local collaborators, murdered more than 2 million people between 1941 and 1945. Of these, approximately 1,300,000 were Jews. But these statistics, however shocking they may be, do not capture the entirety of the genocide on the Eastern Front. Because in addition to the victims of the Einsatzgruppen, there were millions of other deaths. Soviet prisoners of war who died of starvation and disease in German camps, civilians murdered in anti-partisan operations, entire populations exterminated in reprisal for acts of resistance. When we sum up all these categories, the total number of Soviet civilians who died under the German occupation exceeds 15 million. It is a figure so enormous that the human mind can barely process it. How did we arrive at this point? How was it possible that European civilization, in the middle of the 20th century, produced a catastrophe of such magnitude? To answer this question, we must examine not only the actions of the perpetrators, but also the conditions that made their rise to power and the implementation of their genocidal policies possible. Anti-Semitism, of course, was the essential ingredient. But anti-Semitism had existed in Europe for centuries, without producing a genocide of this scale. What was different in the Nazi case? One part of the answer lies in the specific ideology of National Socialism, which combined traditional anti-Semitism with pseudo-scientific theories of racial purity, extreme nationalism, and a cult of violence as an instrument of social transformation. Hitler did not just hate the Jews, he genuinely believed that their elimination was necessary for the survival and flourishing of the German people. Another part of the answer lies in the specific historical circumstances of interwar Germany. The humiliation of the defeat in the First World War, the devastating economic crisis, the political instability of the Weimar Republic, the fear of communism. These conditions created a breeding ground where extremist messages found receptive audiences. And a third part of the answer lies in the nature of the modern totalitarian state. The Nazis did not only have the will to commit genocide, they had the means. An efficient bureaucratic apparatus, transportation and communication technology, systems of population identification and registration, and a military machine without parallel in history. Without these tools of the modern state, the Holocaust on the scale that it occurred would have been impossible. But perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all is that the perpetrators were not monsters of another species. They were human beings like us, with families, with education, with lives that in other circumstances would have been completely ordinary. If they could turn into mass murderers, what does that tell us about human nature in general? This question has no comfortable answer. We prefer to believe that there is a clear line between good people and monsters, and that we are firmly on the correct side. But historical evidence suggests that this line is much more porous than we would like to admit. Psychologist Stanley Milgram, in his famous obedience experiments conducted in the 1960s, demonstrated that ordinary people were willing to inflict what they believed were painful electric shocks on other human beings simply because an authority figure ordered them to. Philip Zimbardo, in the Stanford prison experiment, showed how quickly normal people could assume roles of abusers when the context allowed it. These experiments, although controversial, suggests that the capacity for cruelty is not exclusive to pathological individuals. Under the right circumstances, pressure from authority, group conformity, dehumanization of the other, diffusion of responsibility, ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of evil. Does this mean we are condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past? Not necessarily. Recognizing our vulnerability to evil is the first step to resisting it. If we understand the psychological and social mechanisms that facilitated the genocide, we can be alert to the warning signs and act before it is too late. But let us return to our historical narrative, because there are chapters of the secret executions on the Eastern Front that we have not yet explored with the depth they deserve. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects is what occurred when the wind of the war began to shift. Starting from the German defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943, the Nazi army began a slow but inexorable retreat toward the west. What did this mean for the extermination operations? On the one hand, the mass executions continued and even intensified in some places, as the Nazis attempted to complete their mission before losing control of the territories. On the other hand, a new concern arose: what to do with the evidence. Nazi leaders knew that if the Soviets discovered the mass graves, they would have irrefutable proof of the crimes committed. And although many perpetrators genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, they also knew that the outside world would not share their vision. It was necessary to erase the tracks. Thus was born Sonderaktion 1005, an ultra-secret operation designed to exhume and destroy the bodies of the victims of the genocide. The operation was directed by Paul Blobel, the same SS officer who had commanded the Babi Yar massacre. The procedure was macabre in its simplicity. Groups of prisoners, primarily Jews who knew they would be executed when they finished their work, were forced to dig up the bodies from the mass graves. The remains were piled into enormous funeral pyres and burned. Bones that were not completely consumed were crushed with mallets. The ashes were scattered to avoid any accumulation that could be detected later. The prisoners assigned to this task worked in chains, under constant surveillance. Many recognized among the corpses family members, friends, neighbors. They had to handle the decomposed remains of their own loved ones, while their captors watched. The conditions were indescribable. The stench of decaying bodies, the sight of thousands of corpses, the knowledge that they would be the next to die. Some prisoners lost their minds. Others found a strange determination in the certainty of their fate. If they were going to die anyway, at least they would try to escape. We have already mentioned the escape from Ponary, but there were other similar attempts at other Sonderaktion 1005 sites. Some successful, most failed. The few who managed to escape became invaluable witnesses to what had occurred. How many execution sites were processed by Sonderaktion 1005? It is impossible to know for sure. The Nazis themselves destroyed most of the records, but what is clear is that they could not complete their task. When the Red Army finally arrived, it found numerous mass graves that had not been touched, providing direct evidence of the crimes. The Soviet advance brought with it the liberation of the occupied territories, but also revealed the complete magnitude of the devastation. Town after town, city after city, the liberators found the traces of the genocide: mass graves, buildings burned with people still inside, survivors who could barely believe their nightmare had ended. The Soviets established extraordinary commissions to document the Nazi crimes. These commissions collected testimonies, photographs, forensic evidence. Part of this material was used in the Nuremberg trials, but much more remained in Soviet archives, classified and forgotten for decades. The opening of these archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 revealed information that transformed our understanding of the genocide on the Eastern Front. Documents that had been hidden for half a century came to light. Testimonies of survivors that had never been published became accessible to researchers. Execution sites that were thought lost were relocated. Organizations like Yahad in Unum, founded by Father Patrick Desbois, have continued this documentation work to the present day, using testimonies from local witnesses, many of them elderly people who were children during the war, archaeological investigations, and analysis of archival documents. These researchers have located hundreds of previously unknown execution sites and have reconstructed the circumstances of massacres that otherwise would have been forgotten. The work continues. Every year, new sites are discovered, new victims are identified, new testimonies are documented, and every year, more survivors and witnesses die, taking with them memories that can never be recovered. This race against time raises urgent questions about the future of Holocaust memory. What will happen when there is no survivor left who can give first-person testimony? How will we transmit the knowledge and the emotional impact of these events to generations who never knew anyone who lived them? There are no easy answers to these questions. Documentary archives, recorded testimonies, memorials, and museums are all valuable tools for preserving the memory. But none can completely replace the power of a living testimony, the human connection that is established when a survivor tells their story to an audience that listens. Perhaps the responsibility now falls on us, those who have heard the second or third-hand testimonies, to become transmitters of that memory. Perhaps our task is to ensure that the stories we have received continue to be told, generation after generation, until they become a permanent part of the human conscience. But memory, however important it may be, is not enough if it is not accompanied by action. The commitment of never again must translate into active vigilance against hatred, discrimination, and dehumanization wherever they appear. We must be alert to the warning signs, the speech that turns groups of people into scapegoats, the policies that restrict the rights of minorities, the rhetoric that describes other human beings as existential threats. The road to the abyss never begins with extermination camps. It begins with words, with attitudes, with small exclusions that seem insignificant at the time, but which establish the foundation for greater exclusions. And at each stage of that road, there are opportunities to say no, to resist, to act according to our conscience. The perpetrators of the Holocaust were not born as murderers. They became murderers through a gradual process of radicalization, desensitization, and abandonment of their moral inhibitions. If they could walk that path, we too could do so under the right circumstances. Recognizing this possibility is not an act of pessimism, but of realism. And only by being realistic about our own nature can we hope to avoid the mistakes of the past. But let us now leave the philosophical reflections and return once more to the concrete history. Because there are episodes of the secret executions of the Eastern Front that deserve to be told in greater detail. One of the most significant is what occurred in Belarus, a country that suffered perhaps more than any other under Nazi occupation. Belarus, located between Poland and Russia, was one of the first Soviet territories to fall under German control after the start of Operation Barbarossa. By the end of July of 1941, practically the entire country was occupied, and almost immediately the executions began. Einsatzgruppe B, under the initial command of Arthur Naber, had responsibility over Belarus. Naber was a complex figure, a professional police officer who had joined the Nazi Party out of opportunism rather than conviction, and who would later participate in the plot to assassinate Hitler in July of 1944. But his personal ambivalence did not prevent him from overseeing the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Belarus became a testing ground for mobile extermination tactics. Einsatzgruppe B and its local collaborators developed and refined methods that would later be applied in other territories. Coordination with the German Order Police and with Belarusian auxiliaries allowed for large-scale operations that exterminated entire Jewish communities in a matter of days. Minsk, the capital, had before the war a Jewish population of approximately 80,000 people. In the first months of the occupation, tens of thousands were murdered in a series of actions. The survivors were concentrated in an overcrowded ghetto where the conditions guaranteed a slow death for those who were not selected for immediate execution. But Minsk also became the destination for Jews deported from Germany and other Western European countries. The Nazis had decided that German Jews must also be eliminated, but they preferred to do it away from the eyes of the German population. Thus, trains loaded with Jews from Hamburg, Frankfurt, Berlin, and other German cities arrived in Minsk, where their passengers were executed almost immediately upon arrival. One of the most sinister episodes of the occupation of Belarus was the so-called anti-partisan operations. As we have already mentioned, partisan activity in Belarus was particularly intense. The vast forests and swamps of the country provided ideal refuge for resistance groups that attacked German supply lines and sabotaged the Nazi war machine. The German response was brutal and disproportionate. Under the pretext of fighting the partisans, they carried out massacres of entire civilian populations. The logic, if it can be called that, was simple: destroy the communities that supposedly provided support to the guerrillas. But in practice, this meant executing people who had no proven connection to the resistance. We have already spoken of Katyn, the village where 149 people were locked in a barn and burned alive. But Katyn was only one of more than 5,000 Belarusian villages that were totally or partially destroyed during the occupation. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. It is estimated that between 25 and 30% of the total population of Belarus died during the Second World War. Of the approximately 9 million inhabitants the country had before the conflict, between 2 and 3 million did not survive. It is the highest proportion of any nation in the war. How does a country recover from such devastation? How do you rebuild a society when a quarter of your population has been murdered? Belarus after the war was a country of ghosts. Entire towns had disappeared. Entire families had been exterminated, leaving no survivors. The social fabric that had taken centuries to form was destroyed in just 4 years. The reconstruction was slow and painful. Under the Soviet regime, the memory of the genocide was partially suppressed. The memorials emphasized the suffering of the Soviet citizens, without distinguishing the specific fate of the Jews. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did a more complete process of remembrance and documentation begin. Today, Belarus faces the challenge of reconciling multiple historical narratives. The memory of suffering under the Nazi occupation coexists, sometimes uncomfortably, with the recognition of the collaboration of some Belarusians in the crimes. The legacy of the Soviet regime adds another layer of complexity, and contemporary political tensions influence how the past is remembered and interpreted. But let us leave Belarus and shift our attention to another region of the Eastern Front, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These 3 small countries, located on the coast of the Baltic Sea, had enjoyed independence between the 2 world wars. But in 1940, as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they were annexed by the Soviet Union. The year of Soviet occupation was brutal. Mass deportations, nationalization of property, suppression of national culture. When the Germans arrived in June of 1941, many Balts received them as liberators. They hoped that the Nazis would restore their independence or at least treat them better than the Soviets. This hope would soon prove tragically mistaken. The Nazis had no intention of granting independence to the Baltic states. They saw them as territory to colonize, as living space for the German people, and although they were willing to use local collaborators for their purposes, they never considered them as equal partners. However, the prior Soviet occupation had created a reservoir of resentment that the Nazis knew how to exploit. Many Balts associated erroneously the Jews with the communist regime. This association, combined with pre-existing anti-Semitism in the region, provided the fuel for exceptional violence. Einsatzgruppe A, under the command of Franz Walter Stahlecker, was assigned to the Baltic states. According to its own reports to Himmler, this unit murdered almost 140,000 people in the first 5 months after the German invasion. 136,421 Jews, 1,064 communists, 653 people with mental illnesses, 56 partisans, 44 Poles, 5 Romani, and 1 Armenian were reported as murdered between the 22nd of June and the 25th of November of 1941. The efficiency of the extermination in the Baltic states was remarkable even by Nazi standards. In Lithuania, approximately 95% of the Jewish population was murdered, one of the highest rates in all of Europe. In Latvia, the proportion was similar. In Estonia, where the Jewish population was much smaller, practically all the Jews who had not fled before the German arrival were exterminated. What explains this particular efficiency? The answer lies largely in the role of the local collaborators. As we have already mentioned, Stahlecker preferred to incite local pogroms instead of carrying out the executions directly. Upon entering Kaunas, Lithuania, on the 25th of June of 1941, the Einsatzgruppe freed criminals from the local jail and encouraged them to join the pogrom that was underway. Between the 23rd and the 27th of June, 4,000 Jews were murdered into the streets of Kaunas and in nearby mass graves. But the spontaneous, or semi-spontaneous, pogroms were not enough for the Nazi objectives. More systematic operations were needed, and this is where the organised collaborationist units came in. In Lithuania, the so-called territorial defence battalions and other auxiliary formations actively participated in the massacres. In Latvia, the Arais Commando became one of the most lethal execution units of the entire Holocaust. In Estonia, the local auxiliary police collaborated with Einsatzgruppe A to eliminate the small Jewish community of the country. These collaborators were not merely passive auxiliaries. In many cases, they carried out the executions directly, with an enthusiasm that sometimes alarmed even their German supervisors. They knew the territory, they knew the victims, they knew where to look for those who tried to hide. What motivated these collaborators? The explanations vary. For some, it was ideological conviction, a genuine anti-Semitism combined with anti-communism. For others, it was opportunism. Collaboration offered material advantages, including the possibility of appropriating the victim's properties. For yet others, it was fear. Refusing to collaborate could result in being classified as a suspect oneself. And for some, perhaps, it was simply the opportunity to exercise power over others, to act on violent impulses that in normal circumstances would have been repressed. The war and the occupation created a moral vacuum, where the worst human instincts could express themselves without consequences. But it would be a mistake to characterize the entire Baltic population as collaborators. There were also those who resisted, those who hid Jews risking their own lives, those who refused to participate in the massacres. These people, although a minority, demonstrate that moral choice was always present. The largest massacres in the Baltic states took place in sites that have become synonymous with Nazi brutality. The 9th Fort in Kaunas, Rumbula near Riga, Ponari near Vilna. We have already spoken of Ponari, but the case of Rumbula deserves special attention due to the scale and the systematic nature of the operation. Rumbula was a forest located about 10 kilometers southeast of Riga. In November and December of 1941, it became the scene of one of the largest massacres of the Holocaust. The operation was planned by Friedrich Jeckeln, the same SS officer who had developed the sardine packing method. The objective was to liquidate the Riga ghetto, eliminating all the Jews who lived there. On the 30th of November of 1941, the first phase of the massacre began. The Jews of the ghetto were taken from their homes in the early hours of the morning and forced to march toward the Rumbula forest. Those who could not walk, the elderly, the sick, young children, were executed on the spot. The path to Rumbula turned into a trail of blood. Upon reaching the forest, the victims found already dug graves waiting for them. They were forced to undress completely, despite the intense cold of the Baltic winter. Then they were led to the graves in groups and executed according to Jeckeln's method, lying face down, shots to the back of the next layer of victims over the bodies of the newly dead. Approximately 13,000 Jews of Riga were murdered that day, along with 1,000 Jews from Berlin who had just arrived by train. The second phase took place on the 8th of December. The approximately 10,000 remaining Jews of the ghetto were murdered in the same manner. Around 1,000 additional people were executed in the streets of the city or on the way to the site, bringing the total number of victims for the 2 days of extermination to 25,000 people. How to process such a number? 25,000 people murdered in 2 days, more than 500 an hour, almost 10 per minute, each one with a name, with a family, with an interrupted life. Friedrich Jeckeln personally supervised both days of the massacre. After the war, he was captured by the Soviets, tried in Riga, and executed by hanging in February of 1946. But his death could not return life to his victims, nor repair the damage caused to the destroyed communities. Today, Rumbula is a memorial where the victims are remembered, but for decades after the war, the site was largely forgotten. Under the Soviet regime, no significant monuments were built, nor were commemoration ceremonies held. Only after the independence of Latvia in 1991 did a more complete process of remembrance begin. This pattern of forgetting followed by delayed remembrance repeats itself in many execution sites on the Eastern Front. During the Soviet era, the memory of the Holocaust was subordinated to the broader narrative of Soviet suffering. Murdered Jews were remembered when they were as Soviet citizens, rather than as victims of a genocide specifically directed against them. The reasons for this policy were multiple. Communist ideology rejected ethnic or religious identities in favour of a universal class identity, highlighting the particular suffering of the Jews, would have contradicted this vision. Additionally, anti-Semitism did not disappear with the defeat of Nazism. It continued to exist, more or less covertly, in the Soviet Union itself. The result was that generations of Soviet citizens grew up without knowing the true history of what had happened in places like Babi Yar, Rumbula, or Ponary. They knew that the Nazis had committed atrocities, but they did not know that those atrocities had been directed specifically against the Jews. This situation only began to change with Gorbachev's glasnost in the late 1980s, and more dramatically after the Soviet collapse. Since then, there has been a growing effort to document the Holocaust in the territories of the former Soviet Empire and to build appropriate memorials at the sites of the massacres. But the process has not been without controversy. In some countries, the recognition of the Holocaust has clashed with national narratives that emphasize suffering under communism. Figures who collaborated with the Nazis, but who also fought against the Soviets, have been celebrated as patriots in some circles, generating protest from Jewish organizations and human rights defenders. These tensions reflect the complexity of the region's history, where multiple layers of victimization and perpetration overlap in ways that defy simple narratives. The same individuals could be victims of communism and perpetrators of genocide, or resistors against the Nazis and collaborators with the Soviets. Unraveling these multiple identities requires a careful and nuanced examination of the past. But what lessons can we extract from all this for the present? One crucial lesson is the importance of vigilance against dehumanization. The road to genocide always begins with words, with the characterization of a group of people as others, as threats, as less than human. When we allow such language to become normalized, when we do not actively confront it, we are taking the first step toward the abyss. Another lesson is the danger of blind obedience. The perpetrators of the Holocaust, in their vast majority, were not psychopaths or sadists. They were ordinary people who followed orders, who conformed to the expectations of their reference groups, who abandoned their individual moral judgment in favor of collective authority. Resisting this tendency requires actively cultivating the capacity to think for oneself and to act according to one's own conscience, even when this means going against the grain. A third lesson is the importance of small acts of resistance. Not all of us can be resistance fighters or saviors who risk everything to protect the persecuted. But we can all refuse to participate in discrimination. We can raise our voices when we witness injustices. We can treat all human beings with dignity and respect. These acts, seemingly small, can make the difference between a society sliding into barbarism and one that maintains its humanity. And finally, we must remember that the Holocaust was not inevitable. It was the result of human decisions, of choices made by individuals in positions of power and by millions of ordinary people who chose to act or not to act in certain ways. If those decisions were human, then it is also within human power to prevent them from repeating, but only if we are willing to learn the lessons of the past and apply them to the present.